trickle in now. Welcome back to yet another Clean Health Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about all things fat loss with Jackson Peos. Give me the accent. How do I say the last name?
Come, don't do me dirty like that, Maria.
Peos.
Pios.
Peos. I'm foreign, okay? It's kind of hard for me with the last name. Peos. Peos. Jackson. Jackson is joining our masterclass today. We're going to be talking about all things fat loss. Jackson, the mic is yours to give our listeners who may not be familiar with you a little introduction to who you are, your education, journey in the industry, and what you are doing now.
Yeah, so I just started off as an athlete playing a lot of different types of sports. And as I was playing them, I developed an interest in how can I get faster, better at them, and bigger while I'm playing them. And that sort of directed me towards evidence-based training and nutrition. So my education started with a Bachelor of Science in Sports Science, Bachelor of Science in Exercise and Health. Did quite well with those, and that allowed me to pursue an honours degree in exercise physiology. Did quite well with those studies as well, and then the university offered me a scholarship to complete my PhD, focusing on clinical and sports nutrition. And so over that sort of 4 to 5 year block, I was able to really tackle some of the advanced nutritional concepts, publishing a number of research studies in that time that focused on basically novel fat loss strategies that could assist athletes to make the process potentially a little bit easier on them and to mitigate some of the downsides that typically accompany fat loss. And during that time, that's also when I began working as a remote sports nutritionist with a number of clients in a variety of different clients, a whole lot of Gen Pop, all the way up to national and professional athletes. Now, where we are today, PhD completed, most of my time is directed to remote coaching, working one-on-one with athletes and other clients. And then the rest of my time is, if I'm not playing with my dog or drinking a coconut in Bali, I will be trying to educate and put out content that can allow my followers, people in the industry, to sharpen their blade, so to speak, in this nutrition and training game.
Especially when it comes to evidence-based science to back all of the nutrition stuff. Because in the world of social media, we're all familiar with a lot of smoke and mirrors and BS that's out there. So if you guys do not follow Jackson, make sure you do. Because just like a lot of our other JV partners and us here at Clean Health, we provide a lot of free education across all platforms. Today's masterclass, we're going to be talking about all things fat loss. So some of the 3 key points we're going to be going over are advanced program design protocols for Gen Pop clients and helping your clients maximize their fat loss and body recomp. Then we're also going to be discussing how to overcome any problems along the way, as well as talking about reverse diets, diet breaks, and break down any of the latest research to support these claims. And then, of course, the diet after the diet, ways to help your clients sustain their fat loss results, especially after they have achieved, transforming their physique. So if you guys are listening and have any questions while you're listening, you can type them into the chat and I'll be able to read them out while we are going through the masterclass. But yeah, all of our questions were either pulled from submissions during registration or align with like the topic that we're discussing today. So without further ado, let's dive right on in. So in general, when we're talking about fat loss programming, is there a difference between programming for Gen Pop clients versus, your athletes and pro competitors?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the biggest difference in your approach as a coach or a trainer when dealing with Gen Pop versus an athlete is how meticulous your approach is going to be. Now, there's a number of variables that we can monitor as a coach or trainer And that starts with calories and macros, but it can include many other things, such as your sodium intake, your water intake, how much sleep you're getting, your training volume, training intensity, and so on. And if you're working with a Gen Pop, typically they don't have a whole lot of experience with programming in the past. And the programming that they might have been exposed to up to date is probably going to be quite basic. So even if you think you're a pretty top-notch coach, you can't really throw the kitchen sink at these type of people, because they're just going to get overwhelmed with the amount of things that they need to measure and control, and it would just result in a complete life overhaul. And with a Gen Pop client, you need to understand that while training and nutrition can be important to them, it's certainly not going to be the most important factor in their life. They're going to have other priorities above that. Now, if you make a training or nutrition approach that is interfering with those other priorities, that's going to cause them to buy out of the program. And they're going to say, well, this is not worth it, because a priority that's on ladder 5 of my priority scale is now interfering with something that might be on priority ladder 1 or 2. So you need to understand that first and foremost as the coach. For an athlete, it's a little bit different, because the priorities have shifted a little bit, and their training and nutrition and their physique development or their performance development is typically going to sit on a much higher rung. So even if their training and nutrition is causing compromises in some areas, some other areas of their life, that's okay. That's a trade-off that they're willing to make, because like we said, it's priority rung number 1. So there's a number of things with an athlete that you can program that the athlete will be able to get a benefit from without detracting from the overall process. And these things can include specifics with the dietary program, such as your meal frequency, your meal timing, your peri-workout nutrition, an extra emphasis on recovery, extra emphasis on supplementation, things like that. Whereas if we typically flip it on the other side of a Gen Pop client, we're just going to focus on our big rocks first and getting the big rocks in place. And the big rocks are typically, have we got our overall weekly calorie consumption in line with the body composition changes that we're trying to achieve here? And so if that's sort of to gain a little bit of muscle or to lose a bit of fat, the biggest rock that we need to have in place is our overall caloric load coming in. Once that's in place, then we can take a further step and we can say, okay, well, our calories are in a decent spot now. Now let's look a little bit deeper into our macronutrition. And the next step would be making sure that their protein's in line. So have we got somewhere around 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight? And is that split over 4 to 6 feedings per day? That would be sort of the next step. And then the next step beyond that, if the athlete, if the client, is done these well and they're embracing them and it's not sort of causing impairment to other areas of their life, we can say, okay, well, let's look at our carbohydrate and our fat balance. Potentially, if the Gen Pop client is trying to train hard, how about we now bias some of our remaining caloric allotment towards carbohydrate and bring our fat intake down? Now, they would probably be sort of the basics in terms of nutritional programming that I would be looking at for a Gen Pop client. And then transitioning to the athlete, we would probably go a step further and we say, okay, how is our feeding in proximity to our training window, through our pre-workout meal, our post-workout meal? Is there ample protein on either side of the training window to optimize the anabolic stimulus to training and minimize muscle protein breakdown? Is there carbohydrates there before the training to optimize the performance of the session? And is there carbohydrates afterwards to expedite the recovery processes as quick as we can? And do we have fats quite low so they're not interfering with the uptake of those nutrients which we need to in the bloodstream and not to be delayed through the digestive tract. So they're sort of, I guess, some of the considerations that you need to make when framing your approach based on what sort of client you're working with. Another thing you need to consider is that the social elements of the client you're working with are going to differ between the Gen Pop and the athlete. Typically, if you've got an athlete who's highly motivated, highly driven, you can say, okay, here is your meal plan that we're going to run with for this week. And we're looking to be shooting for like a 90% compliance score across the week or above. And a lot of the athletes, if they are driven, they'll say no worries and that they'll get it done. They have that sort of approach where it's like, if you tell me to eat dirt and it will make me better, then I will
I
do that.
say that all the time.
Completely
Tell
different.
me to eat rocks, I'll eat rocks if I have to.
And then if you flip it to a Gen Pop client, it's a completely different story. You tell them to eat dirt, they say get fucked. So you've got to have some allowances for that. And a big allowance that you can do is, instead of saying, okay, instead of the meal plan, which might be optimal on paper, how about we go with some more flexible allowances? So perhaps we might say, okay, one meal of the day is going to be a completely flexible meal. For example, dinner. This works really quite well. Say, I want you to have a consistent breakfast, lunch, pre-training meal, but for dinner that can be flexible, and you just might give them some rolling calories to shoot for. That might still be too much regimentation for a lot of Gen Pop clients. So instead of just one meal, perhaps you might need to look for a completely flexible approach and give them macros to shoot for in their day, and say, listen, I want you to try to get this over 3 to 4 feedings per day. But if you can't do that, let's just try and get our macros in relatively close by the end of the day. And then you could even take it a step further and say, okay, maybe they've got a crazy work schedule and that's the number one priority in their life, and they can't really commit to any consistent feeding times. Say, okay, let's not stress about macros right now. Let's just try and hit a protein target, and let's try and keep your calories within a range. And then that takes a lot of stress down for them. And for someone who doesn't have their nutrition or their body goals as a higher priority on their list, they don't want that to be causing stress in other areas of their life. So minimal stress approach for these sort of clients is the recommended way to go. And they might only have to sort of shooting into a calorie range and trying to get close to a protein target. That's low hanging fruit. That's what most people will be able to achieve. Whereas if you went with a too regimented approach with too many variables that they need to tick off in their box of their day, they'll get a lot of stress. They will feel unsuccessful because they haven't ticked off all those boxes that you've basically like, listen, mate, you need to get these done. And that's just going to make the process a whole lot less enjoyable, with no better results because they weren't ticking those boxes anyway. Now, I could go on with this question with 100 different factors that are different between Gen Pop and athletes, but that probably gives at least a broad understanding of some of the considerations you need to have when framing the program.
I think another helpful tip to add on to that as a coach is, really, you've touched base on it with both, is address the goal and then address the priority of that goal, and be realistic as a coach of, okay, if you truly want to reach X goal, these are the actions that are necessary. You have to be, consistent with them, accurate with them, and you have to be patient with them. And honestly, when you're clear like that, so when there are errors with, compliance or execution, they already go into it knowing that that's in their hands. And it's, if they're going to be more flexible, they need to also be more flexible with their expectations of what they're aiming to see, right? So you're not a magician as a coach. And I know sometimes it's frustrating as coaches. We really want that success for our clients, but they have to also be able to realistically do the things that are needed to be done. And, we can do textbook like tracking accurately with macros, this, but like you said yourself, not everyone has that as a top priority and may not be able to do so. And then they will be like, well, this program or approach didn't work. Well, yeah, it didn't work for that client because it wasn't something that they could fit into their lifestyle.
I think that's a great point. I think you need to understand that when you're working with a client, their goals need to be tapered or scaled to the amount of work that they're wanting to put in. For example, don't come to me and ask that you want to look like Chris Bumstead if you're not willing to stick to macros
Yeah.
6 out of 7 days or something like that. It's I've used the analogy before, but it's you don't go up to your maths teacher and say, listen, teacher, I want you to make me ace this exam, but I'm not going to study for it. The teacher would be like, what the fuck? Like, how am I supposed to do that? It's the same thing with working in the fitness space. Is typically you'll get a lot of clients, and they usually come from Gen Pop, but they'll have these really, really lofty goals, but they don't want to do their homework, so to speak. So it can be your role as the coach or the trainer to frame their goals in line with the regimentation that they're willing to accept and the approach that they're willing to endure.
Yeah. And when we're talking about like entering the dive, and this kind of goes into our next question as well. You have a client, whether they're Gen Pop or an athlete. How do you identify if that client is ready to enter a diet or fat loss phase? What are like the prerequisites that will allow you to know as a coach and the client to have a successful fat loss or deficit phase?
Yeah. So there's probably a few things that you should be looking for as the coach. The first one is what's their sort of relationship with food currently, and what would you determine as their level of food focus? So food focus, I would define as sort of in your day, are you having preoccupations with food outside of eating scenarios? So, for example, if you're just chipping away in your laptop answering emails, are you thinking about what you're going to have at Nando's in 3 days' time for your refeed or something like that? So, are those thoughts very prominent? What's the severity of them and how frequent they are? If you are finding yourself preoccupied with food at non-eating times a lot of your day, that probably is a good indication that a fat loss phase right now for you is going to be very, very difficult, because if food focus and food preoccupations are already quite high, they're certainly going to be a hell of a lot higher when you start sort of embracing a deficit. So I would try to evaluate that with the client firstly, and just say, just try and work out what their sort of relationship with eating is at this time. And eating psychology is a very, very tough one to evaluate as a coach, and like that's why there's therapists in a completely different field tackling this, and we certainly don't get too much of this teaching and education coming up through the system, even in the university sector. But something that you would want to try to tap into is frequency of binge eating episodes and loss of control of eating, as it's typically referred to in the research. And this is a tough one to engage with, because humans are great liars, and if they're coming to you, a coach or trainer that they most likely respect, and that's why they've hit you up in the first place, they're probably not going to tell you if they had 2 tubs of Ben and Jerry's last night, because they'll be fearful of the response that you might have towards that, or the judgment that they might incur from that. So it can be difficult to do that. Generally, when I'm trying to tap into that, I just frame it with the approach where it's like, listen, I'm trying to help you here. To be able to help you the most, I need you to be as honest, because if I don't have all the pieces, I can't know what next move needs to be played in the game. So food focus and eating psychology, frequency of binge eating episodes, and potentially loss of control over eating episodes, they're something that you would sort of look at initially, because if those things are happening recurrently and frequently, it's probably not a great time to jump into a deficit right now. You probably need to spend some more time in positive energy balance to allow those symptoms to decrease, and then consider a fat loss phase moving into the future. A second point that I'll look at is what's your sort of relative hunger. So in a perfect world, we get mild hunger roughly 30 minutes leading up to a designated eating time. We consume the meal and then we receive satiety for 2 to 4 hours after that meal. Rarely does that happen in practice. So what we don't want is hunger immediately post a feeding event and then lasting all the way to the next feeding event. If that is happening, and the comp preppers will be like, "Yeah, that's me. I know that." It's like you're eating a meal, and it's like the hunger is like increasing with each bite. It's like there's a bucket with a hole in the bottom, and you're pouring water in, but it's just coming out at the same speed. Say less, say less. We don't really want that if we tend to embrace that at the end of a fat loss phase, but we certainly don't want that to be already present before the fat loss phase has begun. So try to work out with your client where their sort of relative hunger is, how long they're getting hungry for before a meal, and how long they'll feel satiated for after a meal. And if hunger is present sort of less than an hour after a feeding event, then that probably means that there hasn't been long enough time spent with a decent caloric supply. So, or that they've just been maintaining their body fat too low, and this will lead me to the next point. And they probably need to spend some more time again in positive energy balance before you'd be able to have a really productive fat loss phase. So the next point, which I just touched on, is to look at their overall body comp. So you'll get clients that come to you that their goal is for fat loss, and then they take their kit off and they're peeled, and you're like, what fat loss? Like the fat's gone. And so if it becomes a little bit tricky depending on what sort of client you're with. For example, if you've got a bodybuilder that wants to get on show, they're already going to be coming to typically lean already, but it's your job to go from lean to shredded. But if it's outside of the competition sector, you want them to have body fat in a reasonable, healthy range. Now, this is going to be somewhere around 15 to 25% body fat for a male, and then take 10% of that for females. If they're much lower than that, then not always the case, but it can be potentially that a few reasons. They haven't spent enough time in a maintenance phase or a building phase yet, because that body fat hasn't accumulated. So that just tells me that they haven't spent enough time in a surplus before it can be ready for the next fat loss phase. And this has been a process. This has been an issue that has been encountered a lot more frequently these days since the rise of social media and just the permanent shredded photos of people all year round. Because now people start their build phases and they get a little whisker of a little bit of softness around that little vein that they had on their bicep. Or like the one ab gets slightly a little bit more faded one morning, and they're like, "No, okay, it's time to go back in the fat loss phase." And this is a dangerous game because muscle gain takes such a long time.
Exactly.
If you're constantly chucking on the brakes and putting the car into reverse to go back and take the fat off, you're never actually proceeding with your journey. You're just going up a little bit forward, then you're stopping and you're reversing back. And this is why a lot of people are sort of just running around in circles, and every cut that they do, when they shred back down, they look the same as when they were last year's cut. So it's important that a client is presenting with a reasonable amount of body fat, not shredded, but a healthy range, where you can then know, okay, well then they've probably spent a good enough time developing, eating up. Their diet fatigue is probably going to be quite low. So that's probably going to mean that at least for the first phase, we're going to be able to have a nice productive push. So they're sort of the to summarize, the things I'm looking for is like the eating psychology, potentially binge eating episodes, and ideally a low frequency of those and a low severity of food focus, where their hunger levels are. Ideally, they're not feeling hungry 30 minutes after a meal. then falling on from that, a body composition that is indicative that they've spent a good amount of time in a positive energy balance, eating up with good food, with optimized recovery, which is an indirect proxy that tells us that this client probably has a low level of diet fatigue and they're in a good spot to proceed with a fat loss phase. They're probably the main things that I'm looking for in an initial client setup.
So then when you are, checking off those boxes and you can see that your client is ready to start their, deficit phase, what is your initial approach to setting up their starting deficit? So how do you go about, knowing where their starting point is, the rate at which you're creating that deficit, and then in relation to that, the stuff like expenditure, like cardio, steps, training. Can you brief us on that, like generally how you do that, or is it different depending on the style of client and the type of client?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to consider, and I'll try to work my way through
Yeah,
them. So when we're talking about the size of the deficit, typically the size of the deficit should be framed based on the client starting body composition, how much fat they're carrying.
yeah,
For example, if you have a client that is presenting with a very high body fat, and a high body fat I would consider much greater than 25% for a male, and 30%, I should say. If someone is presenting with body fats of that level, you can't design a program that is going to result in, for example, 0.5% body weight losses per week, which might equate to like 500, 600 grams on the scale per week. Because if you have someone that is 140 kilos obese and they come to you for fat loss assistance and they see 600 grams on the scale when they've just nailed, let's say, a perfect week of dieting in their books, which could be a complete fucking overhaul to how they were eating previously and requiring a lot of mental resilience and focus on their part, and they see 600 grams, they'll be like, fuck this, it's not worth it. I've just like done a complete overhaul for my whole week, and this is the reward that I get. So it becomes a bit of a mental game when working with the clients in the higher body fat ranges, and you have to encourage buy-in, because the reason that they are overweight or obese is they've had fucking struggles with dieting in the past. So you need to consider that. And a really effective way that you can encourage that buy-in is by pushing the rates of loss a little bit faster. So they can see numbers falling on the scale very quickly, and they say, okay, hang on a minute, I'm actually getting rewarded for my efforts here. The motivation increases, the buy-in increases, and it sort of just spirals as they move through the program. So in terms of numbers, what sort of numbers would we be looking for? 1% to 2% body weight losses would be reasonable for someone in the overweight or obese range. Now, people will be like, oh, like you don't want to go too fast because then like might screw your metabolism or some bullshit. But what the research has shown us is that for people that carry high amounts of body fat is extremely protective over a number of adaptations, metabolic adaptations, muscle adaptations, and hormonal adaptations that typically acquire fat loss or a calorie deficit. So I'll just cover some really quickly. So for example, testosterone. Everyone sort of says like, oh, as you diet, testosterone comes down. In overweight and obese populations, when you take some body fat off them, testosterone typically increases. Same with lean body mass. If you take an athlete, put them through a dieting phase, they'll typically see losses in lean body mass. With overweight or obese populations, their lean body mass will be retained. If not, it will increase a bit if it's been combined with a new training program that they perhaps hadn't been doing before. So when there is high body fat, you can kind of push your guys pretty hard with no real blowback to the process. Like they're not going to be losing muscle. Their hormones are going to be taking a dive. So it's like you can push aggressively, you can get the benefits of the psychological framing and the extra buy-in from the client without having to deal with the side effects that do typically accompany a severe calorie deficit, as we call it. So now we'll flip it on to sort of someone who we'd already consider to be healthy body composition, but they don't just want to be healthy, they want to look fucking good in their bathers or something like that. So the approach shifts a little bit. So when you are going from healthy to lean or shredded, the negative adaptations that accompany the dieting are typically a lot more severe and harder to deal with. And these side effects typically include changes in hormonal balance that threaten our maintenance of muscle tissue, changes in our hormonal balance that make us hungrier, more irritable, decreases in our sex drive, metabolic adaptations. So typically, the longer we diet and the closer we approach to shredded condition, we'll burn less calories just when we're resting and burn less calories when we're performing activities as well. And of course, our lean body mass, our muscle mass, and our strength performance really can take a hit if you're not moderating the size of the calorie deficit. So when I've got someone of a healthy body composition, I would tend to frame the calorie deficit to achieve weight losses in the range of 1 to 1.5% per week, which is a little bit different to the upper level of 2% for someone who's carrying a little bit of excess fat. But this would just be for sort of the first half of the diet, because they're probably going to be at something like 15%, 20% for a male to begin with. And that's an okay amount of body fat. So you kind of want to go at a decent speed so they're seeing the numbers fall. And you got to remember that when you are 15 to 20% for a male, going from 19% to 18%, visually there's not much going on. So if there's not much visually going on, you've got to see the numbers moving. Otherwise you'd be like, well, what the fuck are we even doing here? Like, I can't feel anything happening. So 1.5 to 1% is a good range for the starting phase of the diet. Let's say we have a 12-week diet, maybe from weeks 12 to week 6. That's where we sort of push. And then for the inside of 6 weeks out to the end of the diet, that's when we want to be a little bit more careful with how fast we're pushing things. So you might then want to target 0.5 to 1% body weight losses per week, because at that phase, they're going to be quite lean. They're going to have diet fatigue accumulated. Body fat's going to be low. So the risk of muscle loss is going to be higher. The risk of strength decline is going to be higher. And they're going to have really high hunger, probably low mood. And if you try to take calories too low, then you can potentially run into adherence issues. Yes. So the worst thing you can do is, as someone that's incredibly fucking hungry, is take their food way too low that they just can't stick to it. And then if they start eating more, that's when you can find yourself sort of running in the spot. You're doing this sort of like 2 days good, 1 day bad, 2 days good, 1 day bad. And it feels like you're still dieting, but that eating back is just closing the deficit consistently. You open up the deficit and then you close it with a little bit of like non-adherence, non-compliance. So not going too aggressive in that final stage of the fat loss phase is super important when you are dealing with someone who's quite lean and is most likely been dieting for some time already. If you go too aggressive, then the approach tends to be less conducive to results as opposed to more conducive. But it's quite funny, typically, at least in the fitness scene, competition scene, coaches tend to fuck it up and do it the wrong way round, whereas they start the prep and they're like, okay, we're just going to edge in nice and slowly, and like prep's so easy, and like the client's like, this is fucking great. And then all of a sudden 6 weeks out and like they've still got like glute hang, and they're like, okay, we might have a problem here. And then like the anxiety kicks in, and then these crazy calorie deficits start being engaged with super high cardio, a massive calorie deficit being applied at potentially physiologically the worst time that a large calorie deficit should be applied. So that's something to be worth considering when trying to frame your the size of the calorie deficit on your client. So I think that's only really explained calorie, how to shape up the
Yeah.
calorie deficit. Was the next thing
Yeah,
macros?
so we have just
I've
starting
forgotten.
off the calories, we could talk about macros as well, and then training and cardio. But I did want to touch on a point that you made
Okay.
about especially for like your athletes. I think, I've done both where we took it nice and steady and, pedal to the floor towards the end, and that's when things spiraled quite negatively. I really do think for athletes, especially competitors, like you said, being a little bit more aggressive at the beginning so that, imagine being ready for your show maybe like 3, 4 weeks before the show, and then you can ease on into it, cruising, not stressing, knowing that your body is doing what it needs to do, and you have heaps of time to kind of dial it in the final touches. And like one of the worst things you can do is add extra layers of stress during a dieting phase for an athlete that's a competitor, because their deadline is not flexible. That show day is locked in, they're registered, it's not negotiable. Whereas for your Gen Pop clients, you can keep pushing it back. It's not like they have to step on a stage in a suit, right, to be judged. Their date could be quite flexible depending, right, what their goal is for fat loss. But I really do think that, when it comes to a deficit period, especially towards the end, as minimal stress as possible, especially when you're taking it to the extreme for athletes. I've seen success with myself. I've seen it with my competitive athletes. Mentally, just for like you're being like, I'm not stressed, can help you stay compliant and really help you push through to the end. Because last thing you need to be worried about is, am I actually going to be ready in time? Like, and then it spirals from there, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, let's go talk about cardio and training. So we talked about calories. Now let's talk about programming cardio and training for putting you in a deficit.
Yeah. So let's go training first.
Yeah.
There is a presumption around a lot of people that your training needs to take a complete overhaul. And when I say training, I'm referring to resistance training, weight training. However, physiologically, it makes the most sense that the best way to maintain muscle mass is to train in the same way that builds muscle mass.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people tend to not really grasp that concept. And we need to consider that the the objective of weight training in the context of a fat loss phase is not caloric expenditure.
Yeah.
It is muscle retention. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people, particularly Gen Pop
Yeah.
clients. They could have this 600 per day calorie deficit achieved throughout nutrition. However, they're convinced that the 200 calorie weight training session is like the answer. That 45 minutes an hour that they did is what's causing the fat loss, and that's just not the case. And that tends to for people to put far too much emphasis on trying to achieve caloric burn during a weight training session in a fat loss phase, which is a dangerous game, because typically what people do is there's a few things they do. Number one is shortening rest
Yeah.
times, because they think, whoa, I can't be resting, so I've got to be like high intensity, they will say. Whereas the research has shown that longer rest times are actually more conducive to muscle growth. And with that line of thinking, that leads us to believe that long rest times are also more conducive to muscle retention during fat loss at a time where muscle loss is at a higher risk.
Yeah.
So, as we just said, the objective of weight training in the context of a fat loss phase is muscle retention, not caloric expenditure. So don't go suddenly turning your training into circuit training and doing these little like 30-second rests and then going to pump out another set, because most likely what is happening is you're getting minimally increased caloric expenditure with a significantly decreased training volume. And training volume is the biggest predictor of how much muscle we're going to be able to retain throughout a prep. And if your training volume is taking a massive hit because every time you go into a subsequent working set, you're so fatigued because you haven't given yourself enough time to rest that the performance in that subsequent set is so terrible, then that just puts you in a place where you're potentially at a recipe for muscle loss. So bad thing is remarkably reducing your rest times just because you're in a fat loss phase is a dumb thing to do. A second thing that a lot of people like to do, which I think is a mistake, is to suddenly increase their reps.
Yeah.
Like for whatever reason, when people are bulking, they'll or trying to gain, they'll sit comfortably in that 8 to 12 rep range for the most part. And then the fat loss phase comes along and they're just whipping out these 30 rep sets out of nowhere, like the fat loss sets. As we said, the objective of the weight training is for muscle retention. It's not for caloric expenditure, because the potential for you to be able to burn a massive amount of calories in a 45, 1 hour, 1.5 hour weight training session is just not high.
Yeah.
And the research has also shown us that high rep sets don't actually burn that many more calories than a higher load low rep set. So people have this assumption that if they're doing more reps, because it closely is closer proximity to what cardio looks like, is a whole lot of reps done consistently, that they assume that this is causing more fat loss. So it's not necessarily the case. And the danger of high rep sets is that it means that your training loads need to come down substantially. Now, I said that training volume is a big predictor of how much muscle you're going to retain on a prep. But what I think is a stronger predictor is your strength levels.
Exactly.
So what can you do for a top set in that 8 to 12 rep range? And if the loads that you're typically using around for your PRs or your best efforts in your building phase are suddenly reduced by 25 to 50%, so you can engage in these 30 rep crazy superset, giant sets, whatever they're doing, this is a massive problem, because the heavy 8 to 12 rep sets that built the muscle in the first place, that was a stimulus for the muscle to come on. If you suddenly pull that stimulus out, the muscle has no real reason to stay around. And this is why I think we see a lot of people going through fat loss phases that look like they've lost a lot of their lean tissue in the process, is because they're just not using anywhere near the loads they were typically using in their build phase. So rest times is a really good one, and not increasing your rep ranges much, if at all. They shouldn't really increase at all, because they're really not. I think it's more so a myth that like these high rep sets are toning sets or fat loss sets, but it's mostly bullshit. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on when considering training is people become volume junkies in fat loss phases. And by volume, I mean set volume. So they might do, let's say, like 15 to 20, let's say, working sets per session in their build phase. And then during a fat loss phase, they think more volume, more work, more fat loss. Let's just keep adding sets on, because the more sets I do, the more calories I'm going to burn. But again, it comes back to that initial reframing and understanding why weight training is in our program right now during a fat loss phase. Anyway, it's to hold on to muscle, not to burn calories. So what we need to do here is, I'm just trying to think about the best way to explain this. So when we are in a deficit, we have a reduced recovery capacity because we have less food. We can't recover from as much work. So if we then take the approach of saying, let's start adding more and more sets, it's kind of, it's illogical, because our recovery reserves are going down, and we have these individuals or clients wanting to push the sets up. So they're working in opposition. So a better approach to take with your clients is actually to reduce or moderate overall set volume, so that your sets that you're performing are quality, the sets are occurring with less fatigue, and you're able to more closely approximate your top sets or your best ever sets that you would normally do in a build phase. Because if your recovery reserves is tapped out at, let's say, let's say in a build phase, you can recover from 20 working sets per session effectively. And then you're halfway through your fat loss phase, and now you can only recover from 15 working sets. If you then say, okay, well, let's go 25 sets so we can get a big extra calorie burn, you're just throwing shit on the scrap pile.
Yeah.
It's just a whole lot of junk volume because you can only recover from so much. And that extra sets that you're adding on top is basically providing minimally additional caloric burn with no additional anabolic stimulus and potentially an increased catabolic stimulus. We need to understand that weight training is a catabolic event. But the reason that the net gain is anabolic is, think about it like digging a hole. So we dig a hole, and that's the training, the catabolic event. We break down tissue, cause muscle damage, but then we fill back the hole with our recovery, our eating, and our protein and our carbohydrates and things like that. Now, in a prep or in a fat loss phase, what can typically occur is we start digging the hole, but we dig it too deep by throwing all these excessive sets on top. Junk volume, people might call it. Now, in a fat loss phase, we're not eating as much as we normally would. So we've dug this big fucking hole, but now we can't fill it back up, so we can't get back out of the hole. And this again is a dangerous place to be in a fat loss phase where you've got reduced muscle protein synthesis already from the less caloric load, and now you're going increased muscle rates of muscle protein breakdown because you're throwing a whole lot of extra working sets on top, and that can potentially put you in or make the negative protein state worse on yourself. So I know I went on a few tangents there, but just to summarize it back for the people, some big considerations when setting up training for your clients in a fat loss phase is to try to keep things as similar to your build phase when you're progressing into a fat loss phase, and understand that the reason that weight training is in the program at this time is not to cause fat loss. It's to be able to allow give the muscle a reason to stick around. And we shouldn't reduce rest times. Try to keep rest times as consistent as possible, and certainly don't shorten your rest times, because then again that's going to come at the detriment of your training performance. Don't remarkably change your rep ranges, because that's going to come at an impairment for the loads that you can use. Again, that's pulling away the stimulus that allowed your muscle to come on in the first place. The same things that allowed our muscle to come on are the things that are going to give our muscle a reason to stay around as a deficit progresses. And then just lastly was the comment about volume. So adding a whole lot of extra working sets to your program at a time where the amount that you can recover from is actually diminishing really makes no sense. And if anything, as a coach, you might be looking to scale back the amount of working sets that they're doing in a session, in a week, and allow them to have better quality during their working sets, so they're not under so much fatigue and they're able to better approximate their top sets or their best working sets.
Yeah, and I think it's also important for coaches, in order for your clients to efficiently do that, is to assess how they are training. So knowing that your client knows how to train with the proper intensity, because imagine if you pull back that volume and the number of sets and the number of reps and all of those variables, and your client doesn't perform to their top intensity at all. So one of the things I recommend as a coach is have a way for you to measure their performance, whether it's tracking, the weights that they are using, whether it's sending you training videos, right? Assessing, the level of intensity for that set in some sort of range for you. That way you can ensure that what you are programming, they're executing with proper intensity and execution. So then they're not thinking, well, I just did only 2 sets or 3 sets, and why I feel like I could have done more. That's a good indication that your client is probably not performing with the proper intensity. If they feel like they need more, then are they really pushing themselves properly with the working sets that you are providing? And then one quick question we had from one of our viewers about macros. So we talked about calories, but talking from Casper from Copenhagen, Denmark. Hi, Casper. Question is, what does science show so far on different macro combinations in a caloric deficit in order to optimize fat loss and retention of lean muscle mass. So the percentages of the macro breakdown amongst the calories.
Yeah. So our overall caloric load is going to be the biggest predictor of how much weight we lose. Now, obviously, for most people, they don't just want to lose weight. People in the overweight, obese range, they're only concerned with weight. But for most people that coaches and PTs will be dealing with, it's they want to lose weight, yes, but they want the largest proportion of that weight to be fat and the smallest proportion of that weight to come from lean tissues, including lean body mass, muscle mass, sorry. So the easiest way that we can shift that balance to favor us is to run a high protein intake. So protein would be the first rock that you're putting in place once you have your calories set. Now, for a Gen Pop, somewhere around 1.8 to 2 grams per kilo of their body weight is going to be sufficient. And I say sufficient because they're probably going to be sitting at like mid-range body fat. So their risk of muscle loss is not huge at this stage. And they're going to have moderate but not advanced experience with dieting. So it can be a massive life drain if you try to push their protein intake too high, whereas 1.8 to sort of around that 2 gram mark is realistic for them to achieve without them feeling like they're doing some crazy type diet. For athletes, you can push it a little bit higher, somewhere in the 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight during a fat loss phase is a pretty good place to be. And the reason for that is, number one, because dieting is high on an athlete's priority scale, they have no issues sort of having chicken, steak, protein shakes 3 to 6 times per day. That's easy for them to do. And secondly, they are typically of leaner body comp than Gen Pop. And we know that the leaner you are, the greater protein losses you have, the more susceptible you are to muscle protein breakdown rates. So the more advantage you can have to upping your muscle protein synthesis, i.e. by consuming extra protein to try to balance that out. And there is potential that because athletes are typically training at higher intensities and higher volumes that a Gen Pop, they're having a greater catabolic event during their training versus a Gen Pop, and therefore they're in greater need or they can get greater advantage from that extra protein supply. So that's sort of get your protein rock set in place. And now you're sort of left with your carbohydrates and fats. Now, the research does tell us that the ratio of carbohydrates and fats within your remaining caloric allowance really doesn't impact the amount of fat, certainly not weight that you're going to lose. So with that in mind, for at least a Gen Pop client, you're probably just going to split it up in a way that suits their preferences or their lifestyle. For example, you're probably not going to run a really low fat intake with really high carb intake for them because it's going to limit the amount of types of foods and meals that they consume in a Gen Pop type lifestyle where you are cooking with oils and things like that, like normal people do. Whereas if you flip that onto the athlete side of the spectrum, we understand that, okay, yes, the amount of carbs and fat ratio that we have is probably not going to impact the amount of weight that we lose. But we do know that carbohydrate is the preferential fuel source for high intensity effort, i.e. training, and certainly the hard training that athletes are doing. Now, it makes sense to provide an optimal supply of carbohydrate so that performance can be maximized. And while having extra carbohydrates in your diet might not directly enhance fat loss, it can certainly indirectly provide advantages by allowing the athlete potentially train harder for longer, to recover better, as we know that carbohydrates are the fuel source for the nervous system, very important for recovery. And if they're able to train harder and for longer, that could indirectly have flow-on effects to the fat loss.
Yeah.
And certainly, as we touched on, when we're losing weight, we don't just care about the weight, we care about the ratio of fat mass to fat-free mass. Now, if we're able to train harder and better maintain our strength during weight training, that is most likely going to lead to better muscle retention across a fat loss phase. And in other words of saying that, that means a smaller proportion of fat-free mass in every kilo of weight that you lose during a fat loss phase.
Yeah.
So while the balance doesn't directly impact things, we got to consider that carbohydrates have a number of advantages to athletes that can potentially enhance the training side of things. And if the training side of things is enhanced, that can indirectly have flow-on benefits to the amount of lean tissues that's going to be retained per kilo of fat of weight that's lost. So in terms of like giving some numbers of recommendations for people to wrap their heads around, generally for athletes, you're going to be wanting somewhere around 20% of your daily calories allocated towards fat. That would be considered as like a low to moderate amount. The minimum in terms of like per body weight, somewhere around 0.5 gram per kilogram of body weight is probably the lower end threshold. Now, we don't want to go too much lower than that because we do need a minimum amount of essential fatty acids to facilitate our chemical messages, our hormonal production, and things like that. So you don't want to go too low because that could potentially come at the impairment to testosterone levels and other things like that. But we also don't really have much reason to have a fat intake much beyond that because the benefits are only really coming as potentially lifestyle preference benefits, which aren't hugely important for the athlete. The athlete's sort of like, give me my diet program and I'll fit my life around that. And it's probably just going to make your diet taste a little bit nicer because you're able to have, I don't know, some fucking peanut butter on your toast or something like that. Outside of those benefits, not a whole lot's coming in terms of your performance or recovery or things like that. So at least for the athlete side of things, the benefit does come from keeping on a lower end fat intake. But for Gen Pop, it's probably not going to matter too much because this is a broad comment, but generally Gen Pop aren't training that hard, and so they don't need a whole lot of carbohydrate to support that activity. So that's when the preference of carbs and fats becomes a bigger dictator of where you should allocate your calories to.
Yeah. Hopefully Casper is watching this masterclass at 3 o'clock in the morning. So he's a trooper. Casper, thank you for staying up to listen to us and get educated. And I hope that answered your question. We appreciate everyone who tunes in all around the world anyway. That's freaking amazing. To me, it's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about alcohol consumption. And we're going to tie this into also the question of navigating not only alcohol consumption during a fat loss phase for your clients, but also clients that are social and like to eat out. Is it realistic, to have set a fat loss goal when you are someone that is more social? If so, what are your tips for coaches to help their clients navigate those time periods in order to still have make the progress that they want to see?
Yeah, so we'll go alcohol first, and then we'll go social meals after that. People need to understand that fat loss phases are not permanent. They could be 10 to 15 weeks, once every year, once every 2 years, even. Now, that's not too hard to give up something, I feel. But again, what we need to, that's a bias coming out of what I prioritize in my life. For other people, asking them to like, listen, mate, just give up for 10 to 12 weeks. That's all you got to do. That's a huge ask for a lot of people if their social life is the number one priority in their life. For a lot of people, it is. They might be working some shitty ass job Monday to Friday. They hate it. So their Friday to Sunday and getting on the beers or having the margaritas is their escape from that. And they're sort of, it's very important to their well-being. So we need to understand that. But it's also important as a coach that you're realistic, or that you you temper the client's
Yeah.
expectations when they come into you. Like if a client comes to me and they're like, okay, well, I usually have a big Saturday night, like 8 to 10 drinks, and then like we might have a Sunday session like later in the afternoon, like just like maybe 6 beers on the
That's
Sunday
nice.
afternoon. Yeah, it's like, and they're like, okay, but like, get me shredded. Like, you gotta, and right from that point, you can't just be like, you can't let the client dictate
Yeah.
everything. You are the coach, you are the trainer, you are the point of authority. So you don't let a client come to you and say, this is what I'm going to do, deal with it. You have the right as the coach and the trainer to say, no, hang on a minute. For us to achieve X, there needs to be some trade-offs, Y and
Yeah.
YZ, so on. Now, what I tend to tell clients that I know are drinking relatively frequently is that if you are consuming much more than 1 to 2 drinks on an occasion during a fat loss phase, it makes the job very difficult for us as the
Yeah.
coach or the trainer. Um, because drinking, unfortunately, is not just an isolated event, it has carry on effects.
Exactly.
So, a big night, while it's zapping the deficit of that day and establishing a calorie surplus, it also flows into the next day, potentially even the next 2 days,
Yeah.
because the research has showed us that muscle protein synthesis can be suppressed for up to 48 hours. And alcohol does this really annoying thing where it's preferentially oxidized over other macronutrients. So if you've got on the beers with the boys and then on your way home, you've just slammed like a kebab large chips. And then in the morning you're probably feeling like a little bit hangry, hungover, so you're probably eating some shit in the morning. That alcohol that you've had on Saturday night is going to be potentially in your system for every standard drink you have, it's going to be in there for about an
Yeah.
hour. So if you've done like 12 drinks, you've got like 12 hours where the alcohol is released in your system. And then if you've chucked in a whole lot of food on top of that, that's not being oxidized for energy. And when nutrients aren't being oxidized for energy, that's when they get preferentially stored as body
Yeah.
fat. So alcohol is a nasty game because it sort of like puts on the oxidation brakes like you would normally have. Like ideally in a fat loss phase, we have high rates of fatty acid oxidation occurring because that's how fat loss occurs. But then we put some alcohol in the system, the body is going to designate all of its resources to oxidizing the alcohol
Yeah.
out of the system first before it worries about anything else. So I think people need to understand how dangerous that can be because it's sort of like a compounding issue. We have the drinks, then we lose our inhibitions, and then our dietary choices get thrown out of the window as
Yeah.
well. And then those dietary choices are shit. And so we typically have a higher caloric
Yeah.
load, high carbohydrate, high fat load, and this can't even be oxidized or burnt for energy because we're dealing with getting the alcohol out of the system firstly. Then we compound it further, and then you're dehydrated, you're low on energy, you're low on sleep. Training is going to be terrible for the next day or the day after, and so it just sort of spirals as we go, and then it, in this alcohol that was seen as this one night event, it was like, oh, it's just a couple of hours, like on the fucking mojitos, but then it's become a 3 day issue in essence, and we got to consider that as a coach or a trainer, we're told to um, program relatively moderate caloric
Yeah.
deficits, something like 500 calories a day, which might equate to 3,500 calories across the week to achieve this theoretical half a kilo of body weight per
Yeah.
week. But a big night on the town, like that's cutting it in half at least. And then you've got the additional fat gaining issues that come from the oxidization of the alcohol, plus your training is going to be crap for the day after and
Yeah.
potentially the 2 days after that. So alcohol can be a devil. So obviously, the impairment is going to be scaled by how many drinks you're having per occasion and the frequency of those occasions throughout the week. But generally, what I try to say to my clients and all coaches and trainers should probably say this because it is a fact that much more than 1 to 2 drinks per occasion makes it really hard to have an effective fat loss phase. And I've trialed this. Like a guy who wants to have a wine or a beer with alcohol, you can fit that into your calories. And while that's not a harm reduction method, it's a harm minimization method. And you can still achieve some fat loss and do okay. But once you start pushing into the 3, 4, 5, 6 drinks in an occasion, that becomes a very tough to manage fat loss effectively. And I consider myself a decent coach, but I have a tough time getting people in shape that are drinking quite heavily. So that's something to consider as the coach. Like abstinence is not going to be an option for some people. That's fine. We understand your priorities, but while we might not ask you to abstain, we might ask you to limit at least, or provide some caps. So for someone who I know is a pretty common drinker, or drinking is a big part of their social life, I might say, okay, limit the drinking to once per week. Keep it under 3 drinks in that night. Stick to sugar-free mixes if you're going to go with that, and spirits, and be damn sure that you're not eating like a dickhead on the taxi ride home, and you're pulling to Macca's to get a fucking Big Mac and a cookies and cream flurry. It's like they're sort of that's what I would consider like the best sort of harm reduction method that you can basically prescribe to someone that does want to drink. But also just really try to frame to them that fat loss phases, like we said, they're not permanent. They are 10 to 15 weeks, and partying, your friends, your social life is still going to be fucking there in 12 weeks time. And 12 weeks in like the drop of how long do we party for? From like 20 to 40, let's say, like a 12-week stint to just be like, okay, well, instead of having 9 Jaeger bombs tonight, I'm going to have 2. Like doing that for 3 months of your year, I feel like that's a reasonable ask, and that's certainly something that I'll ask people as the coach.
And also just regardless if it's a fat loss phase or not, I always stress the importance of, we're not just doing this for the way you look or a size or number on a scale. We're trying to optimize your health. We're trying to put you in a better position with your health and wellness. And sure, in moderation, for alcohol for social reasons and whatever, those are your personal choices. But alcohol really doesn't serve any nutritional benefit to you, right? It does more harm than it does good. And I always just stress the importance, if you're going to make those decisions, then you have to accept responsibility for those choices and not be frustrated. I just had a few drinks. When some client tells me that, and then I see the drinks in their stories, I know a few drinks turn into a lot of drinks, and then the post drinks food and all of that. So it's really important to have some sort of structure, right? Some parameters. And obviously when things get really fun, those parameters may go through the roof, but that's fine as long as you have some sort of objective set with your clients. And at the end of the day, if maybe fat loss just might not be for them in that moment. If they truly cannot compromise their social life to a certain extent, if it's really impeding on their fat loss, then it's easy to just be like, hey, listen, maybe maintenance right now, or even reverse dieting, or maybe even being in a build may benefit you more than being in a fat loss phase, for you to chase fat loss Monday through Friday and then drop the ball on the weekend, which we see quite often. And that kind of goes into go ahead.
I was going to say that's a good point. Like for people that are really social, have active social lives, and that social life surrounded around festivals, nights out, all things like that. If I do get a client like that, and I think, shit, they're just not going to listen to me when I say, let's just limit it to 3 drinks and let's just do sugar-free mixes, I might just say, well, let's not do the fat loss phase in summer when they potentially might have been asking. Let's do it through winter, because I know for a fact that the partying and the cool events is going to increase by something like 50%. So it's going to be a big ask for that person to be able to say no to those things, and the peer pressure and all of those things. Whereas winter, potentially a little bit less frequency of those sort of really fun events. So maybe just like lock it down and push into your little like winter shred leading into the summer. And then summer, you're going to be in great shape. And then you've got a little bit more flexibility to be able to enjoy those occasions without saying, okay, I'm only going to have 3 drinks and I'm not having a good time here or something like that. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention quickly is there is this weird disparity in the fitness industry where we do all these wild things like BCAs and refeeds and fucking like protein shakes and pre-workouts and citrulline malate, all these fucking things that are like a drop in the ocean of progress. Yeah. But we do all of these things because we're just trying to get that tiny, tiny little edge. And a lot of the time, the edge is too small to even notice. And it's only that we notice the edge when we compound like 100 different little things that we've done, like meal frequency, meal timing, peri-workout nutrition, all of these things. And then we get a slight little boost. But what we say as someone in the fitness industry, it's worth it. Like, I'll do anything for the edge. People say that, and then they go out and have 7 beers. And it's like, you went through all that effort to compound all these tiny little things that make such a small fraction of your progress. Yeah. But then you're going to engage in a behavior which is known and confirmed to have no benefits, but notable downsides to your training, to your fat loss, to your muscle retention, to your hormonal balance, all these things. It just doesn't really make sense. So sometimes framing that in someone's mind and be like, what are you actually doing, can sometimes be a sort of symbolic slap to the face and can just mean, okay, I maybe need to pull myself up a little bit here.
Yeah, kind of like as a follow-up to like, what supplements should I be taking? Or, those types of questions always get to me regardless of the phase that we're in, when, for example, just dietary adherence is the biggest issue. And I always say, let's focus on the big building blocks, the foundations. Though, we all seen that pyramid as coaches, what you need to focus on. And at the very, very tip is all that other stuff, the minors, right? Usually clients who are not as educated. So like in this field, for example, like your Gen Pop clients who have been, filled with like nonsense from, through the years in the industry and just what they've been seeing with fad diets, this book, that, whatever. They tend to focus on the next best thing. Like, this is a hack. At the end of the day, it's not sexy to be sustainable with your nutrition. It's not sexy to follow a program for 4 to 6 weeks. It's not sexy. It's not sexy. It's not sexy. It doesn't sell. So at the end of the day, you have to really stress, you need to do the boring stuff consistently every single day and be accurate with it. And then if you can do that successfully, then we can sprinkle all the fun stuff, like you said, the post-workout, pre-workout meals, timing, this and that. So especially for Gen Pop, I always try to find like the middle ground of dietary adherence. That's the hugest issue I run into as a coach. And for that very reason, the social aspect, the lifestyle, the busyness, it's quite difficult for coaches. And we have to remember that we don't coach robots, we coach humans. So it's just, that's the art of coaching, is learning how to navigate that with each client that you're working with. And which,
yeah, like if you're having 8 Jaeger bombs on a Saturday, but then you're having BCAs in your Sunday workout, like, you've got to motherfucking shift your priorities.
Yeah, or like the green detox
that's all
the week, right? When drinking or something like that, which I've encountered before, say I'm going to go on this juice cleanse to detox. And I always say the best thing you can do to detox is limit the amount of alcohol you're consuming. You don't need to follow it with
exactly
green juice.
Those BCAs and those green juices are not going to save you, brother. So just, yeah.
And so what you mentioned real quick when you were chatting about diet breaks and refeeds. So let's talk a little bit about that. When is it an appropriate time to assign diet breaks and refeeds, and how are they impactful for fat loss phases, and who are they for?
Yeah, so diet breaks and refeeds were like this meteor that struck the fitness industry, and it was really, really hot, and everyone thought they had these magical benefits, including myself, who went down the route of researching these things thinking that they had a lot of merit. And this merit came from the really sound theoretical rationale. So just briefly, the rationale is that dieting, fat loss, a calorie deficit causes negative adaptations to take place physiologically and psychologically, and these include suppression of metabolic rate, loss of lean body mass, impairment of certain hormonal profiles, increases in hunger, increases in irritability, decreases in mood. The list goes on. All of these side effects. Then some smart chaps came along and said, well, how about if we interrupted the period of the caloric deficit with periods of temporary higher feeding in a state of positive energy balance, i.e. at maintenance calories or slightly above. And these temporary periods of feeding were referred to as refeeds or diet breaks. Now, basically the concept is the same. The difference is mostly the duration. So a refeed might last from 1 to 3 days, and it might be implemented once every weekly or fortnightly, something like that. Whereas diet breaks are typically a little bit longer. They might be up to a week, sometimes even 2 weeks, as per some of the research, but they're implemented a lot less frequently. So maybe you might have them monthly or maybe even bi-monthly. Now, when everyone was using these things and saying they were the holy grail to easier fat loss, we really didn't have research. You would be surprised by how limited the research was when I started researching these things. We had like a 2 week on, 2 week off diet break study, like 2 weeks diet, 2 weeks diet break, in a group of severely obese men with no consideration for macronutrients, and they were all sedentary, doing no training. We had a mice study, and we had a few review papers and a survey on bodybuilders, and all the bodybuilders were like, fuck yeah, refeeds are great. Now, so I sort of like started tapping into the research around these things, and basically came out and found out that a lot of the benefits that we originally thought about refeeds and diet breaks, and I admit I was wrong on this as well, like put my hand up first and foremost. So diet breaks, they don't actually prevent your metabolism from declining any different than it would if you were just doing a continuous diet. They don't really help. It doesn't look like they help with retention of lean body mass. And this was in a group, my research cohort. They were weight trained athletes, and a lot of them were competitors. And they don't really seem to prevent the hormonal decline that normally happens, or the hormonal shifts that happen with dieting. And this is when we were doing diet breaks once a month. So you do 3 week diet and then 1 week diet break. And so I was like, fuck, that sucks. Well, that's not a cool finding, but we did find some cool things. What we found was that the group who had diet breaks in the program, they had significantly lower hunger than the group who didn't have them throughout the whole phase, not just during the diet break period. More people in that group stayed in the study. More people in the continuous diet group without diet breaks, they dropped out. So that's giving us a clue that, okay, if you've got diet breaks, they're probably facilitating adherence because people are able to stay in the study. And we also saw that that performance within the diet break itself, muscle endurance increases. So let's say we do a 3 week diet, 1 week diet break. Inside that 1 week, performance is boosted when calories are higher. It makes sense, but it was cool to see that finally confirmed. And we also saw that mood was improved during the diet break, focus was increased, and irritability was reduced. So while the findings were underwhelming, it certainly doesn't mean diet breaks are a crock of shit. And I would expect that a lot of benefits that we saw in my diet break study would apply to refeeds as well, at least the sort of 2 to 3 day refeeds. And so then it comes back to us as the coach or the trainer trying to decide how should we use these things and who should we use them for. So we know that they're going to reduce hunger and they're probably going to facilitate adherence. So for people who are just starting a diet, that's probably not the right time to be using refeeds or diet breaks because hunger is low when you start a diet, if you're in a good place to be dieting. And adherence should be high. If your adherence is shit at the start of your diet, like, oh, you got a tough time like in 6 weeks. So there's really not any advantage to engaging these things early on because all it's really going to do is extend the duration of that phase because you're not really getting better during during refeeds or diet breaks per se. You might look better because you're replenishing some glycogen and things like that. But in terms of the number one priority, which is the fat loss, you sort of just popped it in neutral and you're just sort of like cruising around. So the first sort of like good chunk of your diet, I wouldn't be really recommending them. When I do recommend them is when the diet starts getting a bit tough.
Yeah.
So if you're a coach or a trainer and you're watching their feedback from their weekly check-in or whatever sort of monitoring method you have, and you can start to pick up some signs of diet fatigue accumulating, like their hunger is getting really hard to manage, potentially maybe even had some oopsie moments.
Oopsies.
And
I believe in oopsies,
yeah,
but
uh,
yeah.
they'll call it that. And like potentially training performance is starting to fall off. Their motivation or the enjoyment of the process is just declining. That can potentially be a good time to instigate these things because it's probably going to help hunger to be a little bit easier managed, and it's probably going to make the process a little bit more enjoyable for them so that they're able to hang in there till the end. And coming off that, if you're of a really high body fat, you're probably not going to need refeeds or diet breaks at all because they're, as we said, body fat is very protective of diet fatigue.
Yeah.
So if you've got a whole lot of body fat, you typically don't have to battle with a lot of the side effects that you would have to battle with during your prep. So it's like, because you're not having to deal with those attacks, you therefore don't need the defense mechanisms to deal with those, and the defense mechanisms being the refeed or diet break.
Yeah.
Whereas for someone like you, Maria, like you're getting attacked by left, right, and center, so that refeed or that diet break can sometimes just be putting the shields up to give yourself a little bit of time to regroup and prepare for the next battle, so to speak. Yeah. So last thing just on refeeds and diet breaks is it doesn't come with no consequence, as we said. So it delays the phase. So for example, like if you're doing a diet break once every month, once every 4 weeks, and it's potentially going to be increasing the length of your diet phase anywhere from like 25 to 40%, depending how long your diet phase goes for. And that can be a downside if you have a time-dependent physique goal. For example, let's say you've got a client that's come to you and they're like, okay, I want to get shredded for my wedding in 10 weeks. I want to be able to look great in my dress. And then if you're not super qualified as a coach, you might hear these things about refeeds. You're like, great, we're going to do refeeds once every 4 weeks. You've just cut out a massive chunk of that potential time where the client has to get better. And for what? Potentially a little bit of lower hunger, better adherence. I'd go as far to say that with a wedding coming up, her adherence is probably going to be as best as ever going to be in her fucking life. So there's probably not a lot of upside to engaging these things because it's just going to suck away potential time where you could actually be moving towards the goal.
Yeah, I agree. And to that point, I think sometimes it's also like how a relationship with food, right? Is that diet break or refeed going to start trickling into like, more and more behaviors like that, where it's like, oh, this is just a refeed. I could go balls to the wall and have as much food as I possibly can, having structure with that as well. And to kind of, as we're going towards the end of the masterclass, I did want us to take a few minutes just to chat about the diet after the diet. So ways, once your clients, you've hit the jackpot, you finally reached that fat loss goal, what are your top tips for coaches to help their clients not only sustain those results, but get out of whatever, protocols were necessary to reach the goals that they've set and the progress that they've made?
Yeah. So humans are terrible at maintaining weight loss post diet. And if we consult the research, at least in the Gen Pop scene, and Gen Pop scene is typically people who are in the overweight range and typically of low training status. Over 50% of them haven't maintained the weight loss a year after the diet. And in a lot of cases, they can be heavier than when they started. Now, this is a massive problem because overweight populations, they're not going into bulks. Like they're not training. So if they do a diet, the purpose of the diet is to get lean and stay
Yeah.
lean. So that's a number one thing that we need to consider, is that maintaining the fat loss post diet is difficult.
Yeah.
So we need to have a very good system in place to mitigate any rapid regain or any rapid blowouts, because the likelihood of them happening is extremely high.
Yeah.
And we have two main systems that we can go with. And having this system in place can also be more important than the diet itself, because if someone loses 6 kilos over 12 weeks and they feel fucking great afterwards, but then they have no system post diet, and this is notorious with the coaching scene when people sign up to these like 8, 10, 12-week challenges with no follow-up afterwards, which a lot of coaches are selling out. Like, I see you all doing it. Then this can be dangerous, because if they don't have a system or follow-up arrangement post diet, and they regain 6 of that in the first 4 weeks post diet, which is very realistic. It's not hard to do if you're quite dieted down and your hunger is high, and you have high diet fatigue. Sometimes, and this is more so happens in competitors, but in a couple of months post end of the diet or prep, you can sometimes find yourself at a higher weight than you originally started the diet 16 weeks ago. So these systems hugely important, because the weight loss is meaningless for a lot of people if it's regained within a month or 2 months. You're back to where you started.
And usually the way I phrase that for clients is, whether they're competitive athletes or Gen Pop, all right, your dieting deficit phase is X weeks plus at least 4 weeks afterwards. So like you said, prepping for like a certain event, whether it's a wedding or a competition or something like that, I always tell my clients that, you can't just drop the ball, and once that event passes, you're just like free for all, because especially at the end of that deficit phase, if your expenditure is high and your intake is quite low, you, like I said at the beginning, for anybody that heard me, you're like a sponge, and you're going to just soak up all of that intake in and be in such a drastic surplus that weight's going to come right on back. And I see this often with my friends who are competitors and who have hindered relationships with food, that, they have been super restrictive for their deficit because of a show, regardless of their approach. It doesn't really matter. Everybody does it differently. And then once the show is over, there's no goal in place, and it's like eating like you've never seen the food before. And I think it's really important, one, to consider not only the deficit and dieting approach, but be realistic with the clients. And I've seen this happen with my clients. They're like, thank you so much for your goal, over helping me reach my goal. Nice talking to you. See you soon. And then 7 months later, come back, and I'm like, we're back at square one. And they're like, man, I should have listened to you. Telling your clients that prior can really save them the heartache of being like, shit, I put in all of that money and work and time and effort and sweat and tears and whatever, just to reverse that, and then if not, go back a few steps. So I know the frustrations in that, as coaches as well, just stressing the importance of it. You have to, whether it's like booking them in for a package that's after the deficit phase too, you got to do something just to have that support. And I've had clients who are like, I can't continue coaching. I'm like, here is exactly how to do it. Let me teach you for your own sake how you should be navigating this, because I don't want to see you struggling after the diet, because it's frustrating as a client, and it's heartbreaking, especially when you get them to that goal, right? And they've already done all the hard work. So I think with today's masterclass, I hope that everybody got.
I reckon we should just touch on the two systems quickly, otherwise, because I said I was going to tell them two systems, and then I didn't say it.
You left the screen. I was like, all right, guys, I'm here by myself. Let me wrap this up. Go ahead.
I've had enough.
Okay, let's wrap this up with you, and then I'll
wrap it up real quick. So, with your approach post diet, you have two main systems that you can go with. We have one side of things called the reverse diet, and we have the other side called the recovery diet. And the approach that you go with is going to be highly predicated by what your goals are post diet. For example, for Gen Pop people, when they lose fat, they lose weight. That typically their objective is to stay like
Yeah.
that. They just fit their fucking swimsuit for summer, and they don't want to have to be bursting at the
Yeah.
seams 3 months later. So the approach needs to be quite tapered coming out of that. So with the reverse diet, typically it'll be a very small caloric increase initially, something in the range of like 100 to 400 calories even. So quite a small increase. And then you will sit on this new caloric intake until your weight gain stabilizes again. And ideally, the weight gain is not quite
Yeah.
large. And then when the weight stabilizes, you'll just add in a small amount again, something around 5% of overall calories, or which is going to look like something like 100
Yeah.
calories. And your protein is going to be staying the same the whole time. So the additional increase is going to come from mostly carbohydrates to get you feeling better, have better well-being and more energy, and potentially a little bit of fats just to help with the overall palatability of the diet and what sort of things that you can eat. But it's a very slow and tapered approach. So an initial 100, 200, 300 calorie increase, wait until weight gain stabilizes, add in another 100, wait till weight gain stabilizes again, and then add in another 100. And the benefits of this is that the caloric adjustments typically happen in line with your metabolic
Yeah.
readjustment. So we add in a little bit to provide a metabolic stimulus, i.e., for metabolism to increase. The metabolism does over time increase, adapt
Yep.
to it, and then we've hit a new baseline. And then we add in another 100 calories to provide another metabolic stimulus. And over time, if you do this over 3, 4, 7 months, all of a sudden, you've added calories so slowly that your metabolism's been able to increase in a way that's able to deal with those caloric increases each time, and fat gain is completely
Yeah.
minimized. So although it's a long, time-consuming and patient approach, it allows you to get onto a really decent amount of calories at a quite a similar body fat level
Yeah.
than you finish the diet with. So that's the approach for Gen Pop people or people that want to stay lean after the diet. On the flip side, you might have athletes who, once they finish the fat loss phase, they want to grow muscle. Now, having a really long engaged period post diet where you're just adding 100, 200 calories each increment is not going to put muscle on. All it's going to do is it's going to slowly close the deficit and then provide a really small deficit over months. That's time wasted. So typically people who are bulking or trying to build muscle, their fat loss has probably been quite severe, their phase, and they probably got pretty damn
Yeah.
lean. So they're going to have a lot of diet fatigue. Their performance is not going to be great, and they're probably going to have really high hunger, low energy levels, things like that. They're in a hole. So let's get them out of that hole as quick as we can. And so we're a little bit more assertive with the initial calorie increase. That might be somewhere to 500 to 1500
Yeah.
calories initially. And that sounds like a lot, but what it does is it does come with some fat gain, but it gets them back to an optimal
Yeah.
state for performance and recovery as quickly as possible. And then from that point, once you've adjusted to that, and it does come with some fat gain, it's a more conducive approach to faster fat regain, but it allows you to get back to a position where you're potentially approximating your pre-diet strength numbers again, you're recovering optimally, you've got motivation to train back, and you're able to instigate that process of muscle gain and strength gain far more quickly than if you just fucked around slowly, sort of feeling the hole
Yeah.
back out and adding calories slowly over time.
Yeah, and there's a time and place for both of them. I've done both myself coming out of competition preps. One, I was just my health was declining and I just needed to, and that was, something that, had me reconsider my actual approach with the competition prep. And, with reverse dieting, it's also a really useful tool not only after the dieting phase, but even prior to it. When I have clients coming to me with really low starting maintenance intake, or like they really don't have really good relationship with food, or they've been undernourishing. I've taken clients, who have come to me eating really low intakes and reverse dieted them for months. And now they're, instead of being in a deficit and like 1500 calories, they could be in a deficit at like 2600 calories. And that did heaps of change when it came to just a relationship with food and being able to eat that much and nourish their bodies, not only for performance, but mentally being able to eat double that, right? And being able to have a copious amounts of food and still be able to reach their goals. So when it comes to, learning about reverse dieting, learning about, performance nutrition, you guys who are listening right now could be really familiar with that Clean Health offers endless amounts of certifications and courses that touch base on, especially when it comes to nutrition. We have a reverse dieting course. We have PNC level 1, 2, and 3. We have, endless free education seminars that we do, master classes, IG lives. Make sure you check out those resources. For everyone that listened through the entire masterclass, I appreciate you. We both appreciate you, and hope that you were able to have some takeaways that you can apply with your own clients. If you ever want to look back at this or reference it, once the recording is finished and edited, we will send it out to everyone. And second note, we do have another masterclass coming your way May 31st with Dr. Lane Norton and Bill Campbell, talking about, coaching competitive physique athletes. So we touched a little bit on that here today. We're going to go even more in depth with that masterclass. So make sure you're following us both on socials, Clean Health and Jackson's Instagram, to really get, your hands on free education. You guys have been amazing. Jackson, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you guys really did enjoy everything. For everyone around the world where it's nighttime, have a good night. When it's morning, good morning, everyone. And yeah, thank you, Jackson, so much for today.
No, thank you for listening, guys, and thank you, Maria, for being a wonderful host, as always.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The most jacked host.
Have a great night, everybody. All right.